He handed me back the house key without looking at me. Not the spare, the original. The one I'd pressed into his palm the day he and my daughter-in-law moved in, when I told him this would always be his home too. He set it on the kitchen counter, like it was a piece of mail he didn't recognize, and then he walked back to the table where she was sitting, and neither of them said another word. That was 3 years before any of this happened. I should have paid more attention to that moment. I should have picked up that key and understood what it meant, but I didn't. That's the thing about hope. It makes you willing to misread almost everything. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 63 years old. I live alone on 11 acres in the hill country outside of Fredericksburg, Texas, and I have a lavender farm that I built from nothing after my husband passed. Raymond died 11 years ago this past March. He left me with the land, a decent amount of debt, and the kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. It just sits down beside you and stays. I worked through it the only way I knew how. I planted things. I learned what lavender needed to survive in this soil, in this heat. I failed 2 full seasons before I got it right. By year 4, I had a small retail operation and a wholesale contract with 3 hotel chains in San Antonio. By year 7, I was turning a real profit. By year 10, I had paid off every cent Raymond and I owed and put $60,000 in a separate account I called the Rainy Day Fund, though Raymond always would have called it the Don't Let Anyone Take This From You Fund. He was practical like that. My son is not practical. He is warm and funny and a little scattered, and for most of his adult life, those qualities served him well enough. He married his wife. I'll call her my daughter-in-law because that's what she was, and because names have a way of making things more personal than they need to be. About 4 years ago. She is from money. Not old money, not the kind that comes with humility, but new money. The kind that comes with a very clear sense of how things ought to be arranged. She worked in real estate development. She had opinions about property, about value, about what was being wasted and what could be optimized. From the very first Thanksgiving she came to this farm, I watched her look at my 11 acres the way a contractor looks at a teardown. I told myself I was imagining it. My son would not let anything like that happen. He loved this land. He grew up on it. He used to follow Raymond around the fence line on Saturday mornings, asking questions about the soil and the deer and the way the creek ran after a hard rain. He knew what this place meant. Or I thought he did. Their first real sign came about 18 months after their wedding. My daughter-in-law had started talking about an idea she called a hospitality concept, a destination wellness retreat, she said. Lavender was very on brand for something like that. She'd been reading about agritourism. She had a business school friend who'd done something similar with a vineyard in the hill country and made significant returns in under 3 years. I listened. I asked questions. I said I'd think about it. She brought it up again at Christmas. Then again in February, with a folder this time, glossy printouts, projected revenue figures, a mood board with words like sanctuary and intentional and restorative printed in a font I had never seen on anything that came from someone I trusted. I said I appreciated the thought, but the farm wasn't something I was looking to develop. She smiled the way people smile when they've already decided not to take your answer seriously. My son didn't say much during those conversations. He'd refill his coffee or check his phone or make a small joke that changed the subject. I noticed that. I filed it away and told myself he was just trying to keep the peace. That's what I wanted to believe about him. Things shifted in the spring. My daughter-in-law stopped coming to the farm. Just my son, every 3 or 4 weeks, usually on a Sunday. He'd help me with whatever needed doing. Fence repair, equipment, maintenance, the kind of things Raymond used to handle, and we'd have a good day, comfortable, familiar. I thought maybe she'd let the idea go. I thought maybe he'd said something to her. Then, one Sunday in May, he didn't show up to help. He called around noon to say something had come up. He sounded fine. Normal. The following Tuesday, my property tax attorney called me. She said she'd received an inquiry from a development group asking about the assessed value of my parcel, whether there were any outstanding liens, and whether the current title had any complications. The group had referenced a family conversation suggesting the land might be available for a partnership arrangement in the near future. I sat very still for a moment after she told me that. I asked her who had made the inquiry. She gave me the name of a development LLC. I didn't recognize it, but when I typed the name into my laptop that evening, the registered agent's name came up, and it was a name I did recognize. A woman I'd met once at a dinner party my daughter-in-law had hosted. Her business school friend, the vineyard woman. My hands were steady when I closed the laptop. I'm not sure why. Maybe I'd been expecting something like this for longer than I realized. I didn't call my son that night. I called my own attorney in the morning, a woman named Harriet who had handled Raymond's estate and who had a way of speaking that made you feel like the situation, however bad, was at least navigable. I told her what I knew. She told me what to do. Over the next 2 weeks, I quietly did all of it. I won't pretend that period was easy. I spent a lot of evenings sitting on the back porch watching the lavender rose move in the wind, thinking about Raymond, thinking about my son when he was small, thinking about all the versions of the future I had imagined for this land that did not include any of this. Grief is not only about losing people. Sometimes it's about losing the idea of who someone is. I planted a row of new lavender that week, Corosso variety, because it's hardy and it blooms late and it doesn't need much from you once it's established. I needed to do something with my hands that was about the future. My son called 3 weeks later on a Wednesday evening. He said he and my daughter-in-law were thinking about coming out that Saturday. He wanted to sit down together and talk through some ideas about the property. His voice had a rehearsed quality to it. Not cold, exactly, but careful. Like someone reading from notes. I said that would be fine. They arrived at 10 in the morning. My daughter-in-law was dressed like she was going to a business lunch. Linen blazer, leather tote, the whole thing. She set the tote on my kitchen table and unzipped it, and I could see papers inside. Folders. Something that looked like a contract. My son hugged me at the door the way he always does, but there was something off in it. Too quick. He went straight to sit down. She laid out the proposal herself. Efficient. Polished. A partnership structure in which I would retain a 30% stake and sign over operational control to the LLC they had formed. They would bring in investors. They would develop the north acreage first, about 4 acres, with glamping structures and a spa pavilion. The lavender operation would continue in a reduced capacity as a heritage feature. There would be income for me, consistent income. More than I was making now, she said. I let her finish. Then I asked my son to look at me. He did, but it took him a moment. I said, "Do you want this?" He said, "Mom, it makes financial sense." I said, "That's not what I asked." He looked at the table. I turned back to my daughter-in-law, and I told her that I had already spoken to my attorney, that the property had been placed into a revocable living trust with terms that would require a unanimous family vote and independent legal review before any transfer of operational control could occur, and that the trust had been structured to include a right of first refusal clause that would make outside investment partnerships significantly more complicated than her projections likely assumed. She stopped smiling. I told her I wasn't interested in the proposal. Not the terms, not the concept, not the partnership. I told her I'd built this farm after burying my husband and I had no intention of watching it become someone else's wellness brand. She said very quietly that she thought I was being short-sighted. I said I thought she was being something worse than that, but I wasn't going to say it out loud in my own kitchen. My son stood up then. I thought for a moment he was going to say something that would change what was happening, something that would remind me of who I knew him to be. Instead, he picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and said they should probably go. He said we could talk later when things weren't so tense. He didn't look at me when he said it. I stood at the kitchen door and watched them back out of the driveway. My daughter-in-law didn't look up from her phone. My son raised one hand in something that might have been a wave. I went inside and washed the coffee cups they hadn't used. That night, I sat with what had happened. Not the proposal. I'd been prepared for that. What I sat with was the expression on my son's face when I asked if he wanted it. That half-second pause. The way his eyes went to the table instead of to me. I had known my son for 37 years. I had held him when he was sick and driven him to baseball practice and stayed up until 2 in the morning when he didn't come home from prom on time. I knew his face. And what I saw in it that morning was not greed. It was shame. He knew what he was doing. He did it anyway. And those are two very different things from being fooled. 6 weeks passed. I didn't call him. He texted twice, short messages, nothing about the farm. I responded briefly. We existed in that way that families sometimes do when something has been said that can't be unsaid and nobody is quite ready to decide what it means yet. My neighbor, Patsy. She runs a goat dairy 2 miles up the road and has known me since Raymond was alive. Came for coffee one Thursday and I told her the whole story. She listened without interrupting, which is one of her best qualities. When I was done, she put her mug down and said, "You know what your problem is? You raised a man who knows better. That's harder to forgive than raising one who doesn't." She was right, and it stayed with me. September came. The lavender had finished its second bloom, and I was getting ready for the harvest festival I host every October. A small thing, a few hundred people over a weekend, cider and lavender sachets, and a woman named Bev who drives in from Kerrville to sell honey. I was stringing lights along the barn when my phone rang. It was my son. He said, "Mom, she left." I didn't say anything right away. I waited. He said he'd come home from work 3 days ago and half the furniture was gone and there was a letter on the counter. He said he didn't see it coming. He said a lot of things after that, some of which I believed and some of which I wasn't sure about. He said he'd been wrong about the farm. He said she had pushed and he hadn't pushed back and he knew that wasn't good enough. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "I know." He got quiet. I said, "I'm not ready." He said, "Ready for what?" I said, "Ready to act like it's fine. What you came here to do, you knew it was wrong. You sat at my table with a contract and you couldn't look at me. That's not something that goes away because she's gone." He didn't say anything for a long moment. I told him I loved him. I told him that wasn't the question. I told him I needed him to sit with what he'd done for more than 6 weeks before we could have the conversation that would actually matter. He said okay. I said I'd call him after the harvest festival. We hung up. I stood in the barn for a while with the string of lights in my hands. The sun was getting low, and the lavender was silver in that particular way. It goes in late afternoon, and I thought about Raymond, who would have known exactly what to say to our son and when to say it, and who also would have had those papers in a trust before the ink was dry on our mortgage. I missed him, not for the first time, and not the last. I called my son the first Sunday in November. He drove out the following weekend. He didn't bring anything with him. No arguments, no plans, no explanations. He was still working on. He showed up at 9 in the morning in old jeans and asked what needed doing. I handed him a pair of work gloves. We spent the day clearing the drainage ditch along the north fence, the one that always clogs after a hard rain. It's not pleasant work. It's the kind of work that keeps your hands busy and your mouth mostly shut, which was probably what we both needed. We broke for lunch and ate on the tailgate of Raymond's old truck, which I've kept running because I can't quite bring myself to sell it. He said, "I didn't understand what you built here until I was trying to give it away. I let that sit." He said, "She made it sound like we were helping you." I let her tell me that story until I believed it. I said, "You wanted to believe it." I said, "You wanted to believe it." He said, "Yeah." There wasn't much more to say about it than that. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But we finished the drainage ditch before dark, and he stayed for dinner. And after I cleared the plates, he sat at the kitchen table and asked me how the trust worked. Not to challenge it, just to understand it. He asked about the right of first refusal clause. He asked about what would happen to the farm when I was gone. I told him everything. I told him it would go to him in full with conditions that protected it from being subdivided or sold to outside developers for 20 years after my death. I told him I'd set it up that way because this land had survived drought and debt and grief and one very expensive lavender learning curve, and it deserved to be treated accordingly. He nodded. His eyes were wet just a little. He asked if he could come back next weekend. I said I'd leave the porch light on. He left around 8, and I washed the dishes, and when I was done, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark acreage and the way the stars were sitting low over the hill. Raymond used to say that good land teaches you patience, whether you want to learn it or not. I think the same is probably true of the people you love. The lavender doesn't know what it went through this year. It just grows. And in the spring, it will bloom again the same as always, stubborn and fragrant and completely indifferent to everything that tried to take it down. I'm counting on that.